Welcome to the Invite Health podcast, where our degreed healthcare professionals are excited to offer you the most important health and wellness information you need to make informed choices about your health. You can learn more about the products discussed in each of these episodes and all that Invite Health has to offer at www.invitehealth.com/podcast. First-time customers can use promo code podcast at checkout for an additional 15% off your first purchase. Let's get started.
You've probably heard by now that omega-3 fatty acids are incredibly important. And when we talk about omega-3s, we're referring to things coming from fish oil, krill oil, flaxseed, chia, for example. And we know that they're important because there's over 30,000 published research trials done on omega-3 fatty acids. They are essential to human existence. And if we are not obtaining enough of them from our diet, it can start to affect so many different systems within our body. So we think about the brain, we think about the heart. It goes far beyond even those two areas. And I want to talk in some detail today about the importance of omega-3 fatty acids and why you should make sure that you have them incorporated into your supplementation routine. I am Amanda Williams, MD, MPH, and that's a really large number of clinical trials that have been done or published research. To have over 30,000 published research studies done on one specific topic is astronomically high. And we know that omega-3 fatty acids are an integral component to so many aspects of our overall health. And when we think about things such as inflammation, we know that omega-3 fatty acids help to combat that or to offset that. And that's why I want to talk about it in more detail today, because first we need to differentiate between acute and chronic inflammation, because you'll hear me talk about inflammation quite frequently. But what we really want to pay attention to is that chronic low-level inflammation. That's what contributes to the pathogenesis of the most common chronic disease states. So we think about heart disease, diabetes, cancers, Alzheimer's disease, kidney disease, respiratory diseases such as COPD and emphysema, for example. We know that low-level inflammation, this chronic, I always say it's like a little forest fire and it just keeps burning throughout the body. This is why omega-3s are so incredibly important. And we know that acute inflammation, on the other hand, this is a welcomed type of inflammation that occurs. This is a very well-controlled inflammatory response that actually has protective roles. It's helping to prevent the spread of infection throughout the body and preventing damage to different tissues. It helps to remove damaged tissues as well as those harmful pathogens, and it allows the body to repair itself. So at the most basic level, an acute inflammatory response is kind of triggered in this setting. It's a tissue injury or trauma that occurs within the body. And then we have, infections potentially by viruses, bacteria, parasites, being overrun with fungi. And we know that there is a classic manifestation of acute inflammation, and this is characterized by the 4 cardinal signs. So we're looking at redness, heat, swelling, and pain. And we know that the redness and heat result from an increase in blood flow to the injury site itself. And then the swelling results from the accumulation of fluid at the injury site. And as a consequence of this, we have increased blood flow. And then we have the swelling, and this can, become problematic in acute inflammatory processes because this can compress nerve endings, which is what generates a lot of the pain. So someone has an injury, maybe you twist your ankle, something along that line. That swelling will actually lead to more compression within the nerve itself. But we have to recognize that there is a clear and distinct difference between that warranted inflammation of acute versus chronic inflammation. And we know that the chronic inflammation is what leads to long-term consequences. And this is why I always refer to it in that setting of inflammaging. and published in the Journal of Gerontology as well as the annuals of the New York Academy of Sciences. The term inflammaging is characterized by chronic low-grade inflammation, and it is this well-known phenomenon now. And we know that inflammaging is a highly significant risk factor for both morbidity and mortality, especially as we get older. And this is why we need to be able to address this. And when we talk about morbidity and mortality, morbidity is referring to having a disease or being unhealthy. So that's going to be the morbidity. And then we have the mortality, and that is referring to the term in which people actually succumb to a particular disease or end up dying from a particular disease. And we know that the chronic low-grade inflammation is this driving force that leads you down that path. So we know that just in the aging process alone, we have a decline in mitochondrial efficiency. So we term that as mitochondrial dysfunction. So if the cell itself cannot create enough energy, well, if we have inflammation that's occurring throughout the body, so systemic low-grade inflammation, that starts to do a lot of wear and tear at that cellular level, which is going to speed along the mitochondrial dysfunction. And this is actually a theory that was presented back in the 1960s. And understanding that when we have this loss of function within the mitochondria, this is what leads to this pro-inflammatory environment in the body. So the things that cause long-term inflammation. So we know the mitochondrial dysfunction, AGEs, which is advanced glycation end products. This is generally due to elevated blood sugar. So we throw diabetics into that group. We throw people who have metabolic syndrome into that group. We certainly know glycation is a major problem. We can look at oxidized LDLs, which is when your cholesterol particles themselves become oxidized, which is incredibly bad for the body. So what do we do to actually combat this type of an inflammatory assault to the system? Well, first and foremost, as I always drone on and on about, is proper diet. So eating nutrient-dense fruits and vegetables, avoiding sugars and the bad carbohydrates, and most importantly, increasing our intake of omega-3 fatty acids in our foods. And getting enough omega-3s can really prove to be difficult when people are following a standard American diet, which is predominantly omega-6 fatty acids. And we are very limited in terms of our exposure to omega-3s. So we know that the typical American will have upwards of 25 times more omega-6 fatty acid exposure than they do omega-3, which is really quite problematic. And the way that you can determine this is by having your fatty acid levels tested. So it's a blood test, and you can see, what is your ratio between omega-6s and omega-3s. And it should be a ideally 2-to-1 ratio. And with most Americans, it comes back somewhere in that 20-to-1. So they have 20 omega-6 for every 1 omega-3, which is incredibly, incredibly problematic. So when we look at the different studies that focus in on chronic low-grade inflammation and omega-3 fatty acids, we really start to see how it is that those omega-3s potentiate such a benefit in terms of easing inflammation within the body. So there are multiple studies done even looking at the Mediterranean diet and looking at fish oil. And one of the best sources of fish oil, if you're not eating fatty fish such as salmon, is to be taking a fish oil supplementation or something like krill oil. Now, there was a study that was done. It was called the Attica study, and they were analyzing the serum blood levels for different markers for inflammation in over 3,000 Greek men and women. Now, these are people who they populated together who did not have any history of cardiovascular disease. So they just went ahead and they were looking at their dietary intake of omega-3s, and then they were assessing markers for inflammation. So in these participants, they had them consume fish every single week. And when they did this, and then they analyzed their serum blood levels for things like C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, they saw this sharp decrease in these markers for inflammation. So what does that truly mean? Well, it means that we definitely need to make sure that we are getting those omega-3s, because we can see it in clear time with these clinical trials that omega-3s lead to a reduction in inflammation. Now, here's another interesting study. They looked at close to 1,000 folks who were involved in the health professions follow-up study, and they were looking at their intake of omega-3 fatty acids, and they found an association with lower plasma levels of tumor necrosis factor alpha. So if TNF alpha levels are high, we know that we have more inflammation. So we know that there are different blood tests that can certainly detect chronic inflammation. So I'll name some of those for you. So if you're interested and you want to know what your chronic inflammation levels are, I would definitely request that you have these blood tests done. So first, we can look at high sensitivity C-reactive protein. We can also look at tumor necrosis factor alpha, so TNF alpha. We can look at our different interleukins. These are cytokines that have many different functions in the body, but we also know that many of these are included in that pro-inflammatory process. So looking at things like interleukin 6, for example, and if we see that these levels are high, then we know that we are more prone to even vascular damage at that cellular level, along with that mitochondrial dysfunction. So in Bite Health, our fish oil supplementation is sourced from these really small fish, such as herring and sardines and anchovies. And the reason why we source these fish oils from those fish specifically is because those tiny little fish have less of that ability to be kind of cluttered with a bunch of toxins. And we know the larger fish generally are going to have more exposure to even things like heavy metals. So our fish oil actually goes through a double distillation process to remove any of those impurities that those little tiny fish may have been exposed to in whatever waterway in which they are sourced from. So we generally are sourcing from the very cold, deep waters off the coast of Norway. And we go through and we process that oil twice, and then we test to make sure that there are no trace amounts of heavy metals or any other contaminants. So you know that when you are utilizing our omega-3 fish oil, that you are really getting the purest amount of those omega-3 fatty acids to really help to support and optimize your overall health. Now, our fish oil is a high potent fish oil. How much does someone generally need? Well, just for overall wellness, I usually would say 2 of those soft gels per day, but there are variations. If someone is struggling with elevated triglycerides, or if there's, multiple chronic disease states going on, sometimes that would be increased and you would take 2 soft gels twice a day. So there's a lot of variables. That's when you'd want to talk to one of our health care specialists, one of our nutritional experts at one of our stores, and they would be able to guide you to make sure that you are taking the right amount. Now, here's a really interesting study that was done out of the University of San Diego School of Medicine, and they were looking at the actual molecular mechanism that makes omega-3 fatty acids so effective in reducing chronic inflammation. Now, this is really key to the whole point of omega-3s here. What they found was that there was a group of specialized molecules called Proresolution Molecules, and they further broke it down into these 3 different types. And what they are is they basically are inflammation ending molecules. So they resolve inflammation. And they found that those 3 different resolving molecules are lipoxins, resolvins, and protectins. Now, where are these highly sourced from? From fish oil. So this is kind of that aha moment for researchers to be able to see that the higher level of these pro-resolution molecules that can be achieved gives you more of the inflammation fighting ability. And this is why fish oil supplementation is so incredibly important. And, study after study, like I said, you can look and see just how many studies have been done with omega-3 fatty acids, and we realize the importance. We understand how incredibly necessary the omega-3s are when it comes to brain development, which is why they are pumping DHA, that form of omega-3, into baby formula now. We also recognize that when it comes to maintaining cognitive function and maintaining the actual structural components within the brain as we age, omega-3s are so incredibly important. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition just came out with their findings between an association of increased intake of omega-3 fatty acids and a greater cortical thickness. That is the region of the brain that is primarily affected by Alzheimer's disease. So they found when people take higher amounts of omega-3s, that part of the brain structurally stays much more sound, which is really very important. And this is an area that many times we just take for granted. We forget that things in the body that are essential, and if we are not getting adequate amounts from our diet, that we definitely need to be supplementing with a good, clean source so we can yield those benefits from those pro-resolution molecules that go after and target that inflammation. And then we can see that adjusted level when you go back in and you look at the blood levels and you say, oh my goodness, yes, look at took fish oil. Now look at these markers for inflammation. They all came down. It's so incredibly impressive to think of things that come from nature and how much of an impact they really truly make on our overall health, which is why I definitely encourage everyone to make sure that you do have omega-3s as part of your daily supplementation routine. The amount that you take really can vary based off of your needs and your dietary intake. And the best way to know is, first and foremost, go in and have your fatty acid levels tested so you can see how deficient you technically are in omega-3 intake, and then speak with one of our nutritionists and they will be happy to assist you in that guidance. And I want to just thank you so much for tuning in to the Invite Health podcast. Remember, you can find all of our episodes for free wherever you listen to podcasts, or by visiting invitehealth.com/podcast. Now, do make sure that you subscribe and you leave us a review. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Invite Health, and we will see you next time for another episode of the Invite Health podcast.